All right, so it is 6:30, so we'll go ahead and get started, and more people may join us as we go. But thank you for coming to us live on Zoom to join the conversation about young adult Quakers who are making good trouble. FCNL is really excited to highlight a lot of the social justice work that our young people are doing around the country. And we have 3 of them joining us tonight who are going to share some more about what they're up to. I'm Sarah Holtzclaw, I'm FCNL's Quaker Outreach Young Fellow, and I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. And I'd like to start by introducing our co-host, who's the farthest away, KODY HERSH, who's joining us from Florida.
Hey, I'm KODY. I use he, him, or they, them pronouns.
KODY is the Youth and Young Adult Coordinator for Southeastern Yearly Meeting. He has written, spoken, and traveled among friends, bearing concerns around sexuality and spirituality, LGBTQ and youth inclusion, and how Quaker faith can lead us to deeper and more radical action in our lives and in the world. KODY is also a member of Christian Peacemaker Teams, or CPT, and has served with CPT in Colombia, Palestine, and with the Indigenous Peoples Solidarity Team here on Turtle Island. He lives on unceded Timucua, Seminole, and Miccosukee land in Central Florida. Our next panelist hails from my home state of Ohio, Megan Fair.
Hey everyone, my name is Megan. I use she, her, and her pronouns.
Megan is a FCNL appointed representative of Wilmington Yearly Meeting and a member of Wilmington Friends Meeting. She's FCNL Field Committee Clerk, and Megan currently serves as the Grant Administrator and Civil Rights Support Specialist for the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CARE, which is the nation's largest Muslim civil rights organization. Prior to moving to CARE's national office in DC, Megan served in their Washington State chapter. Megan's a graduate from Guilford College and was an AmeriCorps member and the AFSC's Area Office of the Carolinas. And last but not least, our final co-host is Lauren Brownlee.
Hi, I'm Lauren Brownlee. I use she, her, hers pronouns.
Lauren's a member of the Peace and Justice Committees of Bethesda Friends Meeting, and 2018 as a member of the steering committee of the Quaker Palestine Israel Network. She spent a month in the West Bank as a member of the DC Peace Team. She did nonviolent civilian peacekeeping in DC and at the southern border. And in Lauren's day job, she serves as the Director of Social Action at a DC area high school. So thank you to all of our panelists for taking the time to lead our conversation tonight on Good Trouble, and to everyone who's tuning in from home. Tonight, there's going to be a lot of opportunities for audience participation. So I ask that if you're not speaking, if you could mute yourself to help with the background noise. A lot of you have already done that, so thank you. And also, if at any point you'd like to share or add to the conversation, feel free to jump in by raising your hand. You have that Zoom feature available on the bottom toolbar. And if you raise your hand, we can call on you and unmute you to share. And if you have any questions or comments at any time, you can also interact with us through the chat feature in your bottom toolbar. So we're going to start things off by asking a question to the panelists and to have them tell us more about the good trouble that they make. So Megan, KODY, and Lauren, could you introduce us to your day-to-day good troublemaking and also share your story of your favorite good troublemaking experience? And in no particular order, who wants to go first?
Okay, I think I can delve into that then. Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us tonight. I do want to apologize in advance as I am actually out here on Capitol Hill in DC. As you might be able to notice, that big building behind me might look a little familiar to you folks. I am, once I finish this call, going to be joining a vigil in honor of Mustafa Ayobi, who is a 32-year-old American Muslim man who was murdered 2 Saturdays ago in a small town outside of Indiana where he lived with his family. I will delve into that a little bit more directly and actually have some asks around standing in solidarity with him and his family. But I do want to honor and speak to Sarah's question. But I just wanted to apologize in advance if there's any disruptions from the fact that I am on a sidewalk right now. I actually had a really nice gentleman who stood right next to me while we were doing the introductions because he didn't want to walk in front of me because he thought I was recording the Supreme Court. So again, just apologies if I'm distracted at any point today. So talking about my day-to-day with around good trouble, Lauren in our planning meeting yesterday brought up this idea about, the tensions around trouble and good trouble, and I'll let her delve into that a little bit more, but it had me thinking about, what good trouble really is and how I would define it. And my anxiety has caused me to be very much a planner. And so I thought instead of being spirit-led tonight, I would go and be Google-led tonight. And so I Googled good trouble to see if I could get a head start on this conversation. And all I learned was that there's an American drama series with that name. And I felt like it was a really good sign for me to just stick with the spirit on this one. So when I'm thinking about trouble, I think about it being disruptive and it being something that might cause problems to the status quo. My mother might define me and trouble totally differently, but for the sake of this conversation, that's how I think of it. And I think about, I hope we can all agree that the history of this country is one of oppression and marginalization, and that the systems that we all currently exist in are built from that foundation of being on stolen land, of a history of being built by the African-American community that was enslaved and brought here against their will. And so I think about good trouble as any action that causes disruption against those systems, right? And so that can be my day-to-day work of filling out grant applications for projects and programs that empower American Muslim youth to stand up to bullies and to feel proud about their identities. That could also be one of my favorite good trouble stories that I think I'll answer and then pass it off to another panelist was just in December. I had a grant opportunity to go to the southern border and stand in solidarity with the migrants who are trying to exercise their constitutional right to claim asylum in the U.S. We had been seeing images of the women and children who were being tear gassed there. And as an organization with the Council on American Islamic Relations, we decided that, we needed to stand up and do something. And I happened to notice on Facebook that a former colleague of mine at AFSC had been mentioning AFSC's movements around an action called Love Knows No Borders. And so I connected with her and she connected me with folks in San Diego. And long story short, we ended up bringing in an American Muslim delegation to participate in an act of civil disobedience on the border, in which some of my colleagues got arrested. So I like to joke that I had the great honor and opportunity of getting the funding, because I was able to get a grant, of getting the funding to get my colleagues to get arrested. It was a really empowering and powerful experience. And to just be in that space and to see how militarized the border is, and to be able to bring together some American Muslim leaders who previously had not been in that space and had not been able to stand in solidarity with other marginalized communities was a great honor. And I will say that on the tour bus back from the border, after our colleagues that had been arrested were returned to us by Customs and Border Patrol, I was sitting on the bus and I couldn't help but overhear the conversation that was happening behind me. And it turned out to be the General Secretary at AFSC talking to a fellow Quaker from Southern California who was raving about their previous experience a couple weeks earlier at FCNL's annual meeting. And it was just this real interesting integration of my worlds and collision of my worlds to just hear AFSC and FCNL and all of my colleagues from CARE talking about this issue. But I'll leave it there. I'm taking up way too much time, but yeah, thanks, Sarah.
Oh, thank you. I see Lauren smiling. Would you like to go next?
I can. I'm just always smiling. So my smiling is never an indication of anything other than my just general joy for life. So when I think about making good trouble, I think about Bayard Rustin's quote that the only weapon we have is our bodies, and we need to tuck them in places so wheels don't turn. And I think especially in the last few years, that has really been my leading, is to listen to where people are asking for people to bring their bodies to show up for things. And I think that is everything from the Women's March and, things like that people are all working together to try to make points by showing up to things. But often, as someone who lives in DC, we get to do a lot of protesting at the White House because so often with the policies that have been happening lately, there are groups that say we really need other people to stand with us to fight whatever the latest policy is. And so I have been to the White House significantly more in the last 2.5-ish years now than I had been before, even as someone before who tried to answer those same calls. But, for all of the different policies from the Muslim ban to the transgender military ban, and on and on and on, the, various things around immigration, around Standing Rock, over and over and over, I just keep changing my signs and showing up at the White House. And at some point last year, I did an Instagram post of me, with one of my signs at the White House. And I said, "Dear White House, we have to stop meeting like this." Because that has been my just sort of constant for the last few years. And I would say in addition to that, I, as Director of Social Action, really try to offer my students opportunities to do some of that same work. And one of my most meaningful experiences of bringing my body somewhere is that I'm in an interfaith group that supports immigration and is a sanctuary church, a group of different congregations around the DC area that work to provide sanctuary, either literally or, supporting other congregations that are doing it literally. And in a meeting for that, there were people who were dreamers who were there who said, "We're going to all of these offices to lobby, and what we keep finding is that we don't have people who are with us as we do it, that we feel really excited about doing it, we feel effective as we do it, but we want other people to be with us, and it feels like people of faith should be the people who are coming and showing up and being there with us, and showing the politicians that people of faith are standing with us." And so then last year in my winter break was one of the days that they were doing some of the action, and I went with them, and it was me and a group of dreamers, and we just spent the day going to offices. And it was really powerful for me because I've done a good bit of lobbying with my students, and it's always, pretty formal. And when I was doing it with this group, they were just showing up at offices and saying, essentially, "We're dreamers, we want to talk to someone," and then the offices would figure out who they could meet with. And it was just an incredible experience. And at each time as we would go around the table and they would each, tell their story, and I would say, "And I'm Lauren Brownlee, I'm a person of faith," just to, represent that voice, to stand in solidarity with them. So I would say that to me was one of my most powerful experiences of showing up for people and making good trouble in that way. And the other thing that was funny on that day, as we were wandering the halls, at one point I ran into Cory Booker, who was in the hallway. And I look up and see him and I say, "Hey!" He says, "Hey." And I said, "We're lobbying for the DREAM Act." And he says, "That's great. Keep up the good work." And I said, "You too. Keep up the good work." So that was great. And then over the summer, I also went to the Senate to do a walkout with that same group when there was a hearing about family separation. So in the middle of some of the testimony about that, we stood up, held signs, and walked out. So that's some of my congressional troublemaking that I have made.
That's incredible. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And can I ask you to share that quote one more time that you started?
Yeah. So it's Bayard Rustin, and the quote is, "The only weapon we have is our bodies, and we need to tuck them in places so wheels don't turn."
I really like that. And that's a great transition into our final panelist, KODY.
Yeah, I think really appreciating each of the aspects that each of you has brought to this question of good trouble. The piece that I want to add is for me, good trouble invokes kind of the ways that I've had to actively train myself to not reflexively be obedient to authority. And I think that's looked lots of different ways in my life, but particularly as somebody who grew up like white, middle class, and Quaker, you know, the like reflexive, oh yes, you asked nicely, I will do this thing, is very strong with me. So one of the pivotal moments for me in that process was the first time that I intentionally risked arrest. And I was with my cohort of folks who were training to work with Christian Peacemaker Teams. It was right after the bombing of the hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan. And we planned a march through the city of Chicago, and a couple of us knelt blocking the doors to the federal building. And I didn't end up getting arrested that day. But the moment where somebody in a uniform came over and told me to move and I didn't, just felt really important in reinforcing that, like, I don't actually have to do what people tell me to do all of the time. And that my ability to listen to how God is leading me in each of those moments is a thing that I am actually strong enough to tap into and drown out everything else, and laser focus on if I have really good community support with me, particularly. And then subsequent experiences where I actually got arrested kind of reinforced that, like, I can do whatever I want. What are they gonna do? And there's something that's just really transformative for me about that energy, which sometimes feels like it's dramatically in contrast to the rest of my life, in which I'm a Quaker youth worker. But when I'm not thinking in terms of kind of like the big energy and optics, they actually don't feel like very different work. Because as Lauren was mentioning, then I get to translate that energy and sense of empowerment and sense of focus, and try and nurture and empower that in folks younger than me. And that is the best work in the world. And, you know, the thing that gives me the most hope on a day-to-day basis.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, good troublemaking is amazing, but I think sharing it with people younger than us is even more so. And so we have some time. I'd like to open that question up to the audience. I wonder if Kendra or Madison, if you would like to unmute yourselves and share about the good troublemaking that you do. Or we also have Christine Ashley, our Quaker Field Secretary. She's raising her hand. I wonder, Christine, would you like to share something?
Let's see if I can figure this out. Okay, can you hear me okay? Okay. Yeah, I have a question, which is, how do we hold the tension between stepping into spaces where we are working towards a vision that we can't quite reach right now? So we want to do and we want to change, and we have a vision of something big and beautiful, and we also can see steps towards that. You know, how do we hold that tension of not getting the world all at once sorted?
I will share that I just finished Rebecca Solnit's new book, and it has some really powerful quotes about that. And yet, just yesterday, I wrote out some of those quotes just in my blog because they inspired me so much. So I'll share a couple of them because I think she speaks to what an important part of this work that is. So she says, She talks about how it's so important to know that we don't know what will happen next, and we have to live on principles, hunches, and lessons from history. She says, stand up for what you believe in, even when victory seems remote to impossible. The consequences are often indirect. She says, when activism wins, it's because, at least in part, the story has become the new narrative, and the story becomes what the mainstream accepts. And she talks about how actions often ripple far beyond their immediate objective, and remembering this is a reason to live by principle and act in the hope that what you do matters, even when the results are unlikely to be immediate or obvious. Hope for me has meant a sense that the future is unpredictable, but know that we may be able to write it ourselves. Ideas are contagious, emotions are contagious, hope is contagious, courage is contagious. When we embody these qualities or their opposites, we convey them to others. The only power adequate to stop tyranny and destruction is civil society, which is a great majority of us when we remember our power and come together. This work is always first and last storytelling work, or what some of my friends call the battle of the story. Building, remembering, retelling, and celebrating our own stories is part of the work. This work will only matter if it is sustained. To sustain it, people have to believe in the myriad small incremental actions. Remember that myriad small incremental actions matter. They matter even when the consequences aren't immediate or obvious. They must remember that often when you fail at your immediate objective, even then you may have changed the whole framework in ways that may make broader change more possible. You may change the story or the rules, give tools, templates, or encouragement to future activists, and make it possible for those around you to persist in their efforts. So that's some of her insights from her new book, Call Them by Their True Names, by Rebecca Stolnett.
If any of you have ever lobbied with FCNL before, you know that speaks really well to our theory of change and personal relationship building and sharing your personal story in congressional offices.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to build for just a second off of what Lauren said, and also what you said, Sarah, about personal relationship building. I think it's Angela Davis that talks about how during the civil rights movement, opponents would often try and build up these movements and the progress is being things done by individual leaders, right? And I think that it's important for us to, and people would then look at, for example, well, I can't be a Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., so I don't have a role in this movement. And so I think it's important for us to remember that so much about this action is to be done in community, right? And finding those like-minded folks and building that community and building that support and recognizing that it can't just be done by one individual.
The ripple effect. I think Lauren's quote also spoke to that.
Looks like Kendra is raising her hand.
Yes. Yeah, Kendra, if you'd like to unmute yourself and share.
Yeah, so I have to leave in a few minutes for another community call. And I did want to share one thing that builds on the quotations about building community. I represent Quaker House here in Fayetteville, and we serve the military and advocate for peace. And so we kind of do that all the time, especially with our GI rights hotline, helping people who need to get out of the military or need to disrupt the way the military is treating them. But that's not the example that came to my mind immediately. What came to my mind was something a little bit out of our actual defined mission. The Human Relations Commission here in Fayetteville was looking at expanding the types of complaints that they investigate to include complaints about treatment of LGBTQ employees. And I knew there was going to be a town council meeting about it and that there would be public comment. And I also knew that there were here in the Bible Belt South, but also in Fayetteville in particular, there was strong religious opposition to that move. And so even though it wasn't quite Quaker House's exact defined mission, I felt that it was very important that somebody from the religious community locally, because they even, some of the opposition even bussed in people from Raleigh to speak at our local town council meeting, that I speak up on behalf of LGBTQ people and their rights and and concerns from somebody else in the religious community here in Fayetteville, because we are well connected to the other religious organizations in Fayetteville. And the reason I wanted to build on some of the things that have been said and some of the quotes, or the quote that you just read, is because even though what ended up happening was the town council decided this was too hot of an issue to even deal with, and they just deferred the whole thing. It was the relationships that I subsequently built with other community activists and other organizations out of that experience that we have since developed a much stronger working relationship across several issues. And so I really do feel that that's important to empower other people by being a voice, but it also connects you to other community members and makes everyone stronger.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you for sharing, Kendra, about the power of relationship building. I sense that thread throughout all of your stories. And that brings us to FCNL's work and the resources and support that FCNL can provide young adults wanting to make good trouble, especially within the advocacy world. And so I'd like to open up a question to our panelists and our audience members. If you could speak to how FCNL supports your good troublemaking and how FCNL empowers your effectiveness in making social justice.
I'd be happy to start that one. So FCNL has been hugely supportive in my work of doing good troublemaking with students. I would say in part because Christine Ashley is so good about letting me know when there are issues that come up that FCNL is working with that are connected to some of the issues that I engage with for my students. And so by doing that, FCNL is able to provide resources on the different topics. Particularly, I teach a genocide studies class, and there was recently, in the last couple of years, there's been work on, and then it ultimately became a law, a genocide and mass atrocities prevention bill. And so Christine let me know as soon as that started, and I was able to track that with my students using some FCNL resources, but then especially working with FCNL on some actual lobbying. And last year in particular, FCNL helped schedule a meeting with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee office to do lobbying on that issue. And it was one of the most impactful experiences in, I think, my students' lives thus far. These high schoolers who are getting to talk to someone on this committee and getting to advocate for something they had really deeply studied and really deeply cared about. And the woman that they met with in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee office was crying as she was talking to them because she was so moved that they cared so deeply. And so that too really stood out to them, and they left that meeting totally fired up to make much more good trouble. And so all of that, and then similar this year, my students who are acting on gun violence, not for my genocide class, but just in my work as director of social action, they too worked with FCNL on that. And both got a little bit of framing, did some processing with FCNL, and so that has been really significant.
Great. And if anyone tuning in also has school groups or any type of group of young people who'd like to get involved with lobbying, you can see fcnl.org/QWC, and we can arrange a lobby training for your group, either through Zoom like this or in person at the Quaker Welcome Center. See, do Megan or Cody have anything else to share?
I think I can take a stab at it. So I want to go back a little bit and tell a little more lengthy story, which I promise Sarah is connected to your question. But it was spurred by something that Cody said. He had mentioned, the role of CPT in, who he is today and the way that he engages with the world. And I was thinking, you folks from FCNL on this call will know that my first engagement with FCNL was actually when I was 16 or 17 and came to a FCNL annual meeting in 2005, 2006, when there was no young adult program. And I will say that 15 plus years later, looking at the program and the resources that FCNL has devoted to engaging with young adults is absolutely beautiful. You know, I think you hear a lot about organizations who say they want young people at the table and maybe don't do enough, maybe not intentionally, but don't do enough to help remove some barriers to getting folks there. And a lot of that can be financial, right? And I will say that, you know, FCNL had a really successful capital campaign, and a large component of those resources are going to bringing young people in, and not just bringing them into programs developed just for young adults, but bringing them into the governing body of FCNL, and really lifting up their voices. And I can say that being a young adult and being a clerk of a standing committee at FCNL, it's a really powerful and beautiful experience. And I've learned so much about myself as a Quaker in that experience. I've learned so much about clerking, and FCNL has really opened that for me. That was my really impromptu plug for FCNL. But the story I wanted to tell about CPT is actually one that got me to FCNL. And I don't think the folks here on the call know about that. When I was 13 or 14 and testing the Quaker community for the first time, someone from the CPT team who had just been in Palestine, witnessing Palestine, came and talked to my rural meeting in Ohio about a time in which he was accompanying Palestinian children to school, and an IDF soldier pulled a gun on the children. And this CPT person stepped in between the child and the gun, pretended to answer his phone, which very much confused the IDF soldier, and then tried to hand his phone to the soldier and said, "It's your mother. She wants to know what you're doing." And so much about that story, that changed my life in so many ways. Hearing that for the first time, had no idea where Palestine was or what was happening. All I'd known about was what was going on in my rural cornfield. And that opened my eyes to not only that issue, but also to what people were doing to make trouble in the world, good trouble in the world. And also not only what they were doing, but how they were doing it, in a creative way that acknowledged the humanity of the others. And I think that really compelled me to get engaged more with Quakerism, get engaged more with making good trouble, and also figuring out what was happening in Palestine, which eventually led me to live in Jordan for a short time, which eventually led me to become connected to FCNL because FCNL was working on issues of Palestine. And I think it's interesting talking to people who are connected to FCNL and learning more about how they found their way there. A lot of times it is, you know, because you care about environmental justice or because you care about Palestine or any of the number of issues that FCNL is working on, and you find yourself there in community with people who are also experts on these things, and you can learn from them and they can learn from you, and I think it's just a beautiful space to be in. One final thing before I stop, when I'm thinking a little bit more about how FCNL has supported the good trouble that I make, while I was living in Seattle, I was very connected to the American Muslim community there. And there are folks in the Iranian community who were interested and also a little worried about what was happening with the Iran deal a couple of years ago. And I learned from FCNL how to lobby, right? And FCNL was also at that time making requests for us to show up in district and to lobby. And so I helped to coordinate a group of Iranian American Muslims from the Seattle area, as well as some Jewish Israeli folks, to come and have a conversation with our elected officials about why the Iran deal was important to us. And I couldn't have done that without my experience with FCNL and also their template on how to lobby, which we used in our meeting before we walked into that office. And I think that we just built so many connections in that space. And, you know, for being a person who oftentimes works in spaces where I'm not the most impacted by the issues that I'm working on, I've been so hesitant to speak for others. But when I can find ways to help get them to the table, and FCNL does that in so many ways and allows for that in so many ways, I think that's really where we can find our power.
Absolutely. And FCNL will be doing that again this spring, March 23rd through the 26th. We'll not just be lifting up the voices of immigrants, but also bringing people to DC, 475 young adults, to help lobby for just immigration reform. And so if you're interested in that opportunity, you can find more information online. And I wonder if KODY would like to share, or if we have anyone tuning in who would like to share about an FCNL good troublemaking experience. If you've been to Spring Lobby Weekend, or if you're an alumni of one of our young adult programs, if you'd like to share, please jump in. I know KODY was involved with FCNL in your younger years. Yeah, if you'd like to share.
So I think of the folks on this call, I've had the least intensive engagement with FCNL, but we keep intersecting over and over again, and that's, I can't overstate how important it is, particularly right now in the current political climate, to have that sense of like the co-workers and company in the work. And especially, I think we're not always great at honoring people who approach the work slightly differently than we do. You know, recently I've been dragged out of congressional offices more often than I've lobbied in them. But it's so important to me to know that FCNL is doing that parallel work. And the way that that deepens my ability to hope is so precious to me.
Thank you.
I want to build on that by just saying, on the day that I was doing the lobbying with the Dreamers, that it was a day that there was a huge movement of people doing sit-ins in different offices and doing, you know, various acts of civil disobedience. And I think that really added to the power of the day, because I think people in those offices took the Dreamers that I was lobbying with, I don't know if I would say more seriously, but they were more willing to engage with them because they felt like the alternative to, you know, their offices having these sing-ins and, you know, all of this other big stuff that was so much more disruptive. And so they felt like, okay, you just want to talk? Yeah, we're really happy to just talk with you. And it really stood out to me on that day how those two sides of being, because I think they're disruptive in different ways. Because again, we weren't showing up, you know, we didn't schedule meetings, we were showing up in offices and saying we want to talk. So they were both disruptive and in these different ways. And I think because they were happening at the same time, it was all the more powerful.
Lauren, was that in February that you were doing that?
No, it was December of 2020.
Okay, I was going to say in February, I was helping folks get arrested for Dreamers as well. So I thought we might be coordinating on the same team there.
And for me, that circles back to Christine's question, which I hear as kind of the tension between incremental change and like systems change, which is such a live question. I think anytime we're coming up on an election in particular, is that question of like, how much do we demand and how much do we compromise? And I think, like, to me, this is a both and answer to that question, is like, we demand and we compromise. We sit in and we lobby. And that we're constantly kind of like shifting who's doing what and who's pushing where. And that those are not in competition with one another.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
The trouble takes many forms.
Hi, this is Eric Ginsberg. I joined the group late. I'm sorry. For some reason, I had it on my calendar for a different week.
That's okay. Hi, Eric.
Hi. I'm just listening to folks. I'm wondering how familiar folks are, if at all, with a group that does what they refer to as bird dogging. Yeah, okay, I see some nodding heads. Yeah, it's kind of an interesting middle ground between civil disobedience and demonstrations and the kind of in-office lobbying that FCNL does, because it involves groups of people organizing in public events and asking very pointed questions of representatives. that require yes, no answers. So, and I say groups because if they don't respond to the question, then hopefully another person gets to ask a question and they will repeat that question and hopefully try to put pressure on the representative to respond. So it's an interesting kind of way to split the difference.
Great. And Eric, while we have you on the line, I know that you've been involved with empowering young adults to make good trouble of their own. Could you share quickly about the high schoolers you've been working with and Grace Dodge?
Certainly, yeah. Grace and I met at the annual meeting. Grace is a high school student at Chapel Hill High and was at the annual meeting. He's a friend in Chapel Hill. And she asked Christine and I whether there was a possibility of getting some lobby training from FCNL locally, because she had a group that had formed around the Parkland shootings. And they wanted to be able to lobby their representatives on the issue of gun violence. And so I was able to go to Chapel Hill High School and we conducted a lobby training for about a half dozen young friends and friends of friends there at Chapel Hill. And I'm eagerly awaiting the next step to find out whether they've organized their lobbying visits and how they're planning on proceeding. So I plan to continue to stay in touch with them and be a resource for them as they develop their lobbying ask. But it was very exciting to see these young friends really interested in becoming personally active.
That's incredible. Yeah, thank you, Eric, for taking that work to North Carolina. If anyone else in the audience would like to jump in and share how you make good trouble, please do.
Hi, this is Jeff Kissling. I'm in Iowa now, and Christine actually kind of helped us get involved with lobbying locally. Some years ago, I went to Washington, D.C. to do lobbying with FCNL at the annual meeting, but I've kind of cut back on that because of fossil fuel and travel to D.C. So having opportunities to work locally fits good for me. One thing we've done recently is I've always been interested in learning more from and about Native Americans, especially these days, because the environment is my concern. And basically, to me, the thing that makes sense is for us to return to practices more like the indigenous people have with respect for the land and each other. But not knowing any Native Americans, I could only go so far. But this past fall, the local environmental groups here in Iowa, Bold Iowa and Indigenous Iowa, organized this march called the Native American Farmer Climate Unity March. And the idea was for a group, there were about 40 Native Americans and 40 non-natives who walked along the route of the Dakota Access Pipeline through Iowa. So we started in Des Moines and went up to Fort Dodge. It was about exactly 94 miles over 8 days. And I felt every one of them. But I hadn't thought ahead of time how much time you would have to spend with people. I don't know why, but 8 hours a day you're walking, you don't have much else to do than gossip or tell stories with each other, actually. So at the end of the days, I had a number of friends who are Native Americans. I was so happy. And then Christine kind of gave us the encouragement to maybe raise some of those issues that came from that with the district offices of our representatives. And so now, so on that march, it was supposed to be oriented towards the environment, but the issue that came up over and over again from the Native Americans was their deep concern about the missing and murdered Indigenous women. It's a huge problem that I hadn't really been aware of, but every one of them was just, had devastating stories about that. And so even though the point of the march, even though we were going to do more on environmental issues, when we found that this was the issue they were concerned about, that was the issue we decided to take on to see if we could do something locally. And so we eventually arranged a meeting in the Des Moines office with Senator Grassley. I met for about an hour with his staff and had an excellent conversation. 4 of the people with us were people who were on the march. 2 of them were Native Americans. Another person was actually someone from my local meeting community, Bear Creek Meeting and Iowa Yearly Meeting Conservative, who had kind of been peripherally in touch with the meeting, kind of off to the side, sort of. So I kind of invited her to come along, and she did, fortunately. But the main thing we talked about was the Savannahs Act, and Senator Grassley's office was very interested in that. He has a lot of concern for Native Americans in Iowa. So I was really glad that Christine kind of pushed us to do that.
Yeah, we're glad too. And if folks are interested in doing Native American advocacy work, like Jeff and friends in Iowa, there's an opportunity on March 6th at 9 a.m. to join a Zoom lobby training. So a conversation just like this over Zoom with Lucina, our Native American lobbyist, and she'll be talking about the Violence Against Women Act and how you can write letters to the editor and lobby in district to support Indigenous people. Well, our time is wrapping up fastly, so I do want to give an opportunity to our panelists to share any closing thoughts or ideas for good troublemaking with our audience. And so if Megan, Lauren, and Cody.
So FCNL has trained me well in lobbying in terms of making a clear ask, right? And so I would like to ask you all to take a very specific action if possible. And I also want to build for a second off of what I believe was it Jeff who was just speaking? Was talking about being responsive and standing in solidarity with the marginalized communities in our area. So as you all have noticed, I am sitting outside in front of the Capitol building, and more specifically in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, because right now there is a vigil that I'm looking at directly for Mustafa Ayobi, who was a 32-year-old American Muslim man who was murdered less than 2 weeks ago in a small town outside of Indianapolis where he lived with his family. Minutes before he was shot in the back, the man who shot him was yelling a number of anti-Muslim slurs. Unfortunately, Indiana is one of 5 states in this country that does not have hate crime legislation. And so at this point, the local law enforcement are not investigating this crime as a hate crime. My organization, the Council on American Islamic Relations, as well as his family, are asking federal law enforcement to consider this as a hate crime. And I want to clarify that as a Quaker, I'm not asking for someone to be punished more severely. It is known that, enforcing hate crimes actually is a deterrent for others, as well as a way to stand in solidarity with a community who's feeling under attack. And so part of what Sarah will send out, I believe, or FCNL will send out, is some follow-up actions that you can take. The family is asking for folks to coordinate vigils in your area to bring attention to Mustafa's death and ask for the federal law enforcement to consider investigating this as a hate crime. The toolkit is very detailed, and I'd also, there's a Al Jazeera Plus video out right now, it's a minute or less, that talks about what happened to Mustafa and talks about the fact that it's not being considered a hate crime in this moment. So that is my ask. That is what this family is calling for. That is what the American Muslim community is calling for. People need to bring some attention to what happened to Mustafa, and this is not a unique incident. I think that we all know that marginalized communities have this happen to them all the time. And this is a great opportunity for us to come together and take a step in the right direction. If you want help connecting to the American Muslim community in your area, let me know. I'm not sure, Sarah, if our contact information is being shared, but I will gladly give it to you all. I'm sure I can connect you with folks in your area.
Thank you, Megan.
I think my final thoughts are also around thinking about lobbying. And as I think about my experience with lobbying with students and the impact that that has, and one of my favorite stories is the very first time that I took students lobbying. And they came back, you know, all jazzed about it. And the next week, a girl who had gone was upset with Beyonce because she had read something about Beyonce that she, you know, didn't like. She thought Beyonce should be doing something differently than she was. And I said, well, why don't you write her a letter? Now that you've, you know, learned how to effectively persuade people, you could write her a letter and get her to redirect her attention to whatever you want it to be on. And she said, no, I think I'm really just going to focus my energies on lobbying my Congress people now. And it was so, you know, such a great moment in terms of understanding how that can shift students' thinking. And so with that in mind, I think what I would encourage people to do is for young adults out there, or for people who are able to work with high schoolers, to get people to Spring Lobby Weekend, FCNL Spring Lobby Weekend. I know that I work at a Catholic school, and when we were doing our gun violence lobbying in December, and the students heard about FCNL Spring Lobby Weekend, they all said, well, we want to go to that too. I said, you seem a little young. But it turns out that even high schoolers with a chaperone are able to go, even though they are not technically young adults yet. So connecting people with the idea of going, I found out recently that it is only about $50 per registration. So, you know, if you have any money to donate to allow other people to go, that's great. But the experience of lobbying can be life-changing for people. And so any opportunity to be a part of doing that yourself, if you are particularly a young adult for the Spring Lobby Weekend, or enabling other people to do it, is always great.
Absolutely. It's a transformative experience and a transferable skill. If you want to, you can lobby Beyonce, but I'm glad that your student had other priorities.
I guess just to add one more thing, this is something that I've been talking about a lot, I think mostly because I need to hear it. But that's for me the thing that makes action that is spiritually grounded unique for me. And that is and Quaker action particularly, is this sense of trust that I'm going to be led where I need to be and to do what I need to be doing. It's really easy for me to get overwhelmed by all of the things that I should be doing in the world, and all of the things that desperately need people to care about them and advocate on them, and just for me to remember to come back always to that, like, where is the energy of God or spirit or love moving in the universe? Like, where is that pulling me to? That is really the work that is mine. And the energy that I have for that work to which I am spiritually called is a very different energy than the work that I have for anything that I try to make myself do.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a really good point to bring up in closing, that we ground ourselves in our good trouble. Yeah, thank you, KODY. And again, I'll ask the audience a last call for you to share about your good trouble. If you have anything you'd like to share in a minute or less, we have a little bit of time if you want to share with the group.
I can share super briefly. I just wanted to say that I've done some FCNL lobbying in the past, and it's been really instrumental in getting me to where I am now, which is with Quaker Voluntary Service. I'm working in an organization in Portland, Oregon, doing lobbying mostly at a state level, but the point about being transferable and being local context, I think, is really important, and just how each in our own communities and in our own way, we can find the ways to make good trouble. And that I think for me personally, and I know a lot of my colleagues, FCNL has been a great sort of stepping off point of that. So yeah, FCNL.
Thank you, Madison.
This is Jeff. I just wanted to quickly mention that I came across kind of a different approach to lobbying yesterday when, again, I was at this time Senator Ernst's office with the Sunrise Movement, and these kids approach lobbying a lot differently. They are loud and they use megaphones, and chants and things, but they get people's attention. So
takes all types.
Yeah, this is Eric again. I think one of the things that was helpful to me, and hopefully to the students that I trained last month, it was to point out to them that this is something we're in for the long haul. And the real goal here is to build relationships, because you want them to know that while you're here talking about something today, you're going to be back in a couple of weeks or maybe a couple of months, but you're not going away. And so the more you work to build that relationship, the more productive your conversations become.
Thank you.
This is Christine, and I'm really wondering, how can people over 35 best support people under 35 to make good trouble?
I love the theme that's happened tonight about uplifting young adults and investing in their opportunities to lobby. And friends can definitely do that through financial support with FCNL of Spring Lobby Weekend. I think you can also do things in your own community, like what Eric shared. He took his lobby training from FCNL and shared it with high schoolers in his local community. I think that could take a lot of different forms, and we've heard about a couple different options tonight, but I'd say just sharing your experience and your skills, and then also, if you can, the financial support to let others have the opportunities in Washington, D.C.
And I would just add, invite people along. If you're doing some of these actions, invite young people that you know to do it with you. Because I think often people are just looking for ways in. And I think, as KODY said earlier, it can be scary at first. And so having people that we trust to do it with us can, I think, always makes us feel more empowered to do whatever that next step is in our action journey, good trouble journey, etc.
Thank you. So I'd like to close in the manner of friends. If we could have a moment of silent reflection through Zoom, all of us in our different homes, but we'll settle in for a minute. Great. Thank you, friends. And if that was your first time having silent worship over Zoom, I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any outstanding questions or comments, you can drop them in the chat box below. If you're interested in following up with any of our panelists or keeping up with FCNL's work, you'll receive an email after this call with all the information you need, and you can also always find us online. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll stay on a little bit longer if you have anything to say in the chat bar.